I remember when I first heard about this virus and I walked into my lab at work and I said, tomorrow, this is before anything was announced. I said, tomorrow we're probably going to shut down and we'll be shut for 6 months. I said, there's something quite bad that's about to happen. People just looked at me like there's not a possibility that that's going to happen. And this was like 3 days before we shut down. And of course, I got the shutdown part right. That is, we wouldn't be going back to work in that space again. I got the timing, of course, all wrong. It wasn't 6 months that we came back to work. It was obviously much later. So, yeah, I mean, I watched this from within a public health school as a person who's studied infectious diseases and around lots of people who were epidemiologists, who, of course, became the sort of public stars of the epidemic. And I think that the chances of us being able to have handled this um, perfectly, as per plan, as you said, um, was remote because, and we saw this early on, the obvious reason that we knew of at the beginning of the pandemic is that we don't have a centralized public health system. We have 250 mini public health systems. And when you have an illness that's, airborne and doesn't care about your state lines, you is going to run rampant through your system. And so the fact that we had no public health system, let alone all of the other problems with supply chains, et cetera, was very predictable to me that we would handle this badly. Now that was what we knew, right? We had a healthcare, a public health system that wasn't going to be able to handle a pandemic. But what we didn't understand at that point, of course, is that we would have a government that was working against us as well, right? The government was not merely neutral, but the government was misinforming, lying, underplaying, dividing. And, that has stayed with us for 3 years now, right? I mean, 2.5 years now that we have just not recovered from that. And, you have a small window, we thought, at the beginning of the pandemic, when, like with other infectious diseases, where you can, control through contact tracing and good surveillance. And we couldn't control because of, by the time the Trump administration admitted there was a problem, contact tracing and surveillance were almost impossible. And so at that point, it was over and we were off to the races. Whereas other countries that were centralized and did things right did better. Although everybody's had a problem, right? Over these 2.5 years, except if you are China and are willing to shut down your entire population for 2.5 years, you can have an authoritarian treatment of an infectious disease. And this is what happens. But, I think that we couldn't possibly see what the divisions would be. And of course, we weren't prepared in the sense of our vulnerable populations have never been taken care of, weren't prepared, were particularly unprepared before the pandemic and are unprepared again now, right? So, the people, this was not, when you think of a pandemic, you think of it as sort of a random thing, right? You could get it, I could get it, I could give it to you, you could give it to me. But that's not the way it was here, right? This was a pandemic that disproportionately affected certain people. It wasn't random. It was people of color. It was people who had, essential public jobs, which were mostly people of color. It was old people. It was prisoners, right? There were very specific populations that were affected and died disproportionately. And that was the case essentially for the first year of the pandemic until we had a vaccine. And then there are other reasons why things have changed. I mean, as you know now, there probably is very little difference in terms of blacks versus whites dying of this illness. And that's quite amazing. Usually in this country, blacks will die of anything faster than whites because of our care for them and their vulnerability and the legacy of problems in black communities and not being taken care of. But at the moment, because there are so many people in the Republican Party particularly living in rural areas, who've heard that they shouldn't be vaccinated, and they're predominantly white, as opposed to Black communities where information about the pandemic has moved through the churches in particular. You now have more whites dying than Blacks, which is, quite interesting in the United States, and is simply a result of misinformation, as opposed to historically where we've had trouble with mistreatment. Now it's misinformation, and people are simply, killing themselves. So that's where we are.